Hello and welcome to a bonus edition of the Athletic FC Tactics Pod. I'm Alex Barker, I'm joined by Liam Tharme, and we're going to be telling you everything you need to know about Luis Enrique's PSG. PSG are on incredible form, they've just wrapped up Ligue, and at the time of recording they look set to win the title unbeaten, which has never been done before. They're in the final of the Coupe de France, and of course they face Aston Villa in the Champions League quarter-final this week. A good starting point, I think, is to look at the lineup which beat Liverpool in the round of 16, which is more or less their strongest team, I think you'd say. So going one by one, we've got Gianluigi Donnarumma in goal. We've got Achraf Hakimi at right back. Marquinhos and William Pacho, as well as Nuno Mendes, finishing off this back four. Then throughout the rest of the team, a midfield of João Neves, Vitinha and Fabian Ruiz, and a front three can really interchange some players here. So we're being maybe a little bit cheeky saying this is the first choice front three, but we've got Kavicha Kvaratskhelia, Ousmane Dembele and Bradley Barcola. Now, I think a lot of people are fairly aware of these players now, but it's time to go through the way they generally play. So Liam, hit me. How would you outline the way PSG play?
Sure, I think Luis Enrique's had a clear idea, a philosophy that he often he's brought throughout his clubs. That almost what a Luis Enrique team looks like just by the way they tend to shape up on the pitch, sort of regardless of the colour of the kit. The build-up shape tends to be some kind of 3-2-5. We've seen really a different approach on the two different wings. They tend to be really sort of wide dominant, partly because how sort of compact opposition sides tend to play against them, often in the mid block or the low block. Normally we'll see Achraf Hakimi pushing up in that right half space, so at times almost sort of onto the last line. Last season that was with Ousmane Dembele out on the right wing, and his job was really to hold the width because they had Kylian Mbappe the other side, so they wanted to give him more freedom. Hakimi would push on, and the left back, which last season was Lucas Hernandez a lot, or they had some other options there, and that left back would then be sort of more defensive, and it would be one tucking in, one pushing on, and making the 3-2-5 that way. We've seen a slight change this season. You mentioned about Dembele, him being moved to number 9 is a real success of Luis Enrique, sort of, as a coach, has unlocked Dembele's form massively. It means they can now get Kvaratskhelia in that team on the right, or sometimes Barcola plays there. As you mentioned, they change positions throughout the game, so calling them a front three, they can kind of, form in sort of any way that you want. We still see Hakimi pushing on, as that sort of is really well set up there. But they're even more fluid down the left side, I'd say, now this season, where you've got Nuno Mendes, who you of course mentioned in the starting 11. He's been great, one of the great examples of their sort of young signings and their approach to recruitment, and one of the ways they've benefited that we'll come on to sort of post Mbappe, where they've got a bit more flexibility now down both sides, that they can have fullbacks either on the overlap, on the underlap in the half spaces, and really sort of overloading those opposition lines, because that's what Luis Enrique's game is all about: controlling territory, controlling possession, and then getting those sort of 2-3 player moves to generate cutbacks and good chances close to goal.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying as well, this is something we've spoken about as two people who are big fans of French football. We are one of the few people in the world who watch Ligue 1, of course. And it's worth saying they do play very differently in the Champions League and Ligue 1, like you've outlined there. I think this is the lineup people will be familiar with in the Champions League. In Ligue 1, I feel like we've seen them play a 4-2-4 as well at times, right? I don't know if you had any thoughts about that quickly.
Yeah, I think it's a really smart approach, actually, where you think that people would sort of normally assume you have to play the same team all the time to get them sort of used to playing, and they've peaked quite late in the Champions League season. They're obviously quite lucky that it's a league format, because if it had been a group stage after their 6 games, they wouldn't have probably had enough points to go through. They won their final 2 games against Stuttgart, against Man City, and were really good. And he's found the balance with this team in midfield, especially having some sort of size and physicality with Fabian Ruiz. João Neves and Vitinha have been excellent in terms of their sort of counter pressing and their energy, but are better when the ball's on the floor and they can tackle and can engage that way. And they just don't need that in Ligue 1 games as much. They have so much of the ball. They do come up still against quite, I think, a few more pressing teams than people might imagine. It's not all sort of purely low block, and it means really that what they needed then is more technicians and physicality. So we've seen a lot of Desiré Doué this season, a signing from Rennes. He's been fantastic. Lee Kangin as well, another sort of good technical midfielder. That those are players that at times Luis Enrique has started playing out on the wing, and then sort of in Ligue 1 games can drop them back into midfield as sort of a number 8 in advance of a Vitinha. Warren Zaire-Emery, one of their academy graduates, is another great example of those players that you tend to stock up on in the league games. And you can look at a spread even of their league minutes played. We've got a great viz that we use to sort of show that in terms of a balance of their age, how old they are. We know how sort of young they're moving as a team. I think hardly any players, sort of bar Marquinhos and maybe Milan Skriniar, that are sort of the wrong side of 30. But there's not a huge amount of players that even go above the 75% sort of minute cap for minutes played in Ligue 1. They're able to rotate. Of course, they benefit now from a slightly smaller league when Ligue 1 moved to 18 matches. I know they asked again this season, I think, for the Ligue 1 games to be postponed between Champions League games, which they had last season. It's been rejected this season by their opponents. But it's a real strength that they can be so interchanging, even, as you say, about keeping the same system but with different players. But I also think from a rest perspective that these players aren't playing too many minutes and probably not playing too many minutes sort of consistently or in a condensed manner, which I think massively helps keep them fit. They've not been too injury hit at all this season, and people, I think, only seem to realise that when a team is injury hit. You have to remember when they are consistent and playing well, that's because sort of physically they're keeping tabs on that there.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground there very nicely. Thank you. And that I think it's easy, especially with a Luis Enrique team at the moment, where there's so much going on the pitch, to kind of, I guess, lose sight of like what they actually do to try and hurt you. So let's just look at their strengths for a second. How would you, if you were to try and outline it clearly, very simply, if you're preparing to face PSG, what are the ways they can hurt you?
I think the best part now is that they've got a bigger variety of ways to hurt teams. They're definitely a lot more vertical this season. I think João Neves has been a big signing for that. So last season, often you just said the game plan is, well, we need to stop either the source into Mbappe, or we try and sort of double up on him, or at times even triple up on him. And it was, if you can stop him, as a lot of teams did in the Champions League, then it's okay, you've got a genuine good chance. Whereas now the threats, as you say, are a lot sort of wider spread. Dembele's got a real good amount of goals this season, but there's goals and assists sort of across that midfield and that front line. I think the profiles now that you see, Bradley Barcola down the left is a real big threat, sort of running onto those through balls in behind, and that's really important because it means if teams want to defend in the mid block and keep that high back four or a back five, for instance, then they have to engage and put pressure on the ball, because as soon as they switch off and don't sort of put pressure on either Mendes or Vitinha, especially João Neves when they get on the ball, they can play those passes, and teams have been picked apart a lot of that. One ball in behind, Dembele will start in an offside position, Barcola races through, easy cut back and they can score. They've got the most fast break shots in the league as well, so they're a high possession team but are stacked with sort of dribblers and pace up front, so can quite easily turn a team around once they regain the ball, which I think is something we've said about other sort of top teams in sort of Liverpool, Manchester City in England, when we look at successful teams there that have done well in European competition and won the Champions League and their own league, that you need that variety of threat. They've still got the most dribbles in Ligue 1 as well, so it's sort of about balancing that, I think, and not just being that team that sort of cycles the ball along the back and only works for openings, sort of tap-ins, but they're really good now at sort of just turning it on through dribbles if they need to as well.
Yeah, the dribbles point's actually something that's really impressed me in the Champions League particularly, because I don't think it was something that was benefiting them actually earlier in the competition. If you look at statistics on Opta, you would find in the Champions League that PSG near the top for dispossessions and mispossessions, losing the ball a lot. And if you go back through their earlier games, I think the ones where we were starting to write PSG off, particularly the one against Arsenal, where they really struggled to do anything against them. In that game, PSG lost the ball 9 times in their own third through Arsenal's pressure. And I think what we've seen across the season, on this point of dribbles, but also, I guess, just a wider strength of PSG's build-up, is very specifically to the Champions League, I guess, where you're getting a lot of teams applying a ton of pressure on them. And you're right to say that's not exclusive to the Champions League. We do get that in France as well, but it's benefiting them at the right time that they've become a very press-resistant team. And to round this bit off on the Arsenal front, as I said, Arsenal won the ball 9 times against them in their Champions League group stage tie. That is more than Liverpool managed to win the ball against them in 120 minutes at Anfield. So that dribbling point, I think it's one that's very aesthetically pleasing about PSG, and it's also become very, very dangerous for them. It's just made them such a press-resistant team. And talking of pressing, let's actually flip it, because I think the thing that's really impressed people about PSG this season is the defensive end. It feels very new to them. The fact that they seem to be now a very good pressing side, not this quote-unquote lazy team, I guess, out of possession. What are your thoughts on this? Hit me with some numbers, because I know you got some good ones.
I hope I do. It's been the thing I've enjoyed the most actually about PSG this season. They get so many plaudits, right, for how sort of young and technical and stylish they are to watch. But I think that's one side of the game. But there are a lot of teams now that can do that and play in that way. There's not that many sides that can mix that with being so aggressive, sort of so nasty, hard to play against. I think the Manchester City sort of second half really was a phenomenal example. Just how aggressive that midfield three can be, sort of picking up second balls, their counter pressing that. They've really pinned teams back really, really well, and they've made chances. They've made more goals this season off of, those turnovers, which is important for a team that, especially as we mentioned in Ligue 1, sometimes you play against a high-pressing team, but have a lot of blocks that they play against and trying to break them down. So if you can, maximise those opportunities where opponents have the ball and make those turnovers, it's really, really important. I think back to a game at the end of last season when they won away at Nice, and the right back, I think for the opening goal for Nice, tried to dribble out up against the high press, and it wasn't Kylian Mbappe on the left wing, who is sort of renowned for being phenomenal, but also sort of quite lazy and not a big contributor defensively.
Which is something Real Madrid are struggling to deal with as well.
Precisely.
At the
So we're talking about a mood problem there. And Barker tackled the right back, cut inside and scored. I think it's been a really interesting part of the post-Mbappe era now. Because there was, we're talking about now being almost a year on from between the quarterfinal was last season when they came back from behind against Barcelona in the first leg, when there's video clips now that have sort of done the rounds again on socials of Luis Enrique sat down in a one-on-one meeting with Mbappe. He's speaking to him in Spanish about it, and he's showing him clips from the first leg and saying, you've got to press Gubasi, you've got to go, you've got to be a leader. He's citing, I think, Michael Jordan. He's just imploring this guy of like, what more do I need to do sort of to get you to press and to contribute? And I think they do now benefit in a sense that without Mbappe there, Barcola offers a lot more defensively. I mean, pretty much any winger will offer a lot more defensively, but it's having that, he wants to play such an aggressive man-for-man style that means if you've got one weak link anywhere on the pitch, it doesn't matter if it's your centre-back up against a number 9, whether it's your winger, because a lot of what he'll do is have sort of Dembele as the central striker, and one of the wingers up on the edge of the box to man-mark the position centre-backs, and then typically he'll drop the left winger deeper to mark the opposition right-back, and then he'll bump Hakimi all the way up and say, look, we'll leave our centre-backs on halfway and our left-back on halfway. Hakimi, go get up the pitch and sort of press their left-back. So it's really aggressive and risky in that regard. Liverpool tried to sort of go direct with it with those long balls to Salah, and it bears out all of the numbers. So we're looking at 66 final third regains this season, purely in the Champions League, which over 12 games is coming out at more than 5. There's a good number of those, 18, that have been ending in shots and a couple in goals as well. It's their most final third regains in a Champions League season for the data that we've got available going back to 2018-19, which of course includes them reaching a Champions League final, includes them reaching a Champions League semi-final last season. So I think it's about, if you look at their PPDA, so the number of opposition passes that are happening before PSG jump in, I believe it's down by about 4 passes from the final season before Luis Enrique came in. So we're talking 3 seasons ago, they were allowing opponents 4 more passes before making a tackle, an interception. So it just shows how much more aggressively they're diving in now.
Yeah, we can actually look at that comparison. We've got some visits here for audio listeners. We've got PSG's final third regains in 2022-2023, which is the season under Christophe Galtier. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's been quite a few PSG managers to keep track of in recent years, and for this season as well. And as you've kind of spoken about, the numbers have increased massively. So in that 22-23 season, PSG were making 0.5 final third regains per game that ended in a shot. That's increased by 1 this season, which doesn't sound like much on its own, but that is quite significant in data terms as well. In just in terms of total final third regains, that's up from 4.3 to 5.5 in this two season window. And that's illustrative of 2 things, I think. Firstly, the fact that PSG, like you said, are being a lot more aggressive and a lot more successful as well, getting more shots off. But also just the fact, I guess, the change in mentality. Like this season under Christophe Galtier, I remember this was when PSG were being a lot more passive without the ball. And in some ways, you could have expected PSG to maybe be a bit more passive this season because they're facing harder competition. Their Champions League run in the group stage, like we spoke about, some really hard teams in that run. No one would have blamed them if they were going to try and play on the counter-attack. If anything, this was probably the season to do it. But they've been more aggressive than those previous teams. And I guess that's a good point I want to hit on as well, as we kind of talk more about Enrique in general. Like, this is the first time, I don't know about you, if you think this is the clearest identity PSG have had. I think that's also why people are liking them too. I mean, we've got in our notes. Can you describe, just now, off the cuff, the way any PSG team played before Luis Enrique took charge. I mean, I know like we've not been around for all the PSG teams since like 2013, but I've been watching them since Thomas Tuchel, and I have no idea how I could describe even the Tuchel team played. Always felt pragmatic, right, to get the best out of the attackers, would you say?
Yeah, it feels like before it was a lot more of fitting a system around the players that you've got, and that makes sense when they had sort of superstars. They had, if you think back to the Cavani, the Icardi days of sort of big goal-scoring number nines, players where you go, we'll build a team around them, or Verratti in midfield. They had the. It's not to say they don't have sort of star power now, because they do, and that obviously bears out also in their transfer fees. You look at the money they're spending on players, that hasn't dropped. They're kind of just spending it a little bit differently. But I think they've got a lot more versatility about them now, and that's one in terms of, we're talking about how they tend to shape up to play in similar ways, but often with different players popping up in different positions. So you might see Ousmane Dembele is sort of the number 9 on the team sheet, but he'll drop in super deep because he wants the ball to feet, and then you might get Jean Neves moving up, to be the furthest forward player. You've got central midfielders rotating out into fullback spots and then pushing on. And it's a similar concept now with the press, that you can drop players in, take them out, players come on, the press doesn't collapse at all. We've got a great visit that sort of shows their PPDA, which we're using as a proxy. It's not perfect, but it's a good marker of sort of pressing intensity. And you can see last season under Luis Enrique how it really climbed throughout the Champions League games, and these can be a little bit more volatile to look at in terms of sort of game state having an impact there, that if you go ahead in a game you might sit back more than in perhaps a league game. But for me, it's the real consistency this season of almost every game has been a decently high level. It's not like they're going up and down, or they're sort of keeping that at a real high level. And realistically, that number of regains we were talking about before, in terms of it going up, I think about 1.2 per game, could be even higher. I was looking at the stats in terms of opposition goalkeeper launch rate, so how many times they're kicking the ball. I believe it's 40 plus yards, either straight from a goal kick or an open play. And in open play, it's 1 in 2 passes against PSG are being kicked long by the goalkeeper, which is the highest or the highest against any team in the Champions League this season. So teams have clearly, found out very quickly that, okay, this team really can press. They're really quite intense. We're not going to bother risking it trying to go through. We'll just go over from the start. We kind of saw that with Liverpool in the first leg of the round of 16, and I think people were quite surprised, saying that's kind of a real underdog tactic. That teams now are scared of them. And I think that's part of the reason why, as you say, that because it's not a case anymore of just stop 1 or 2 or 3 really talented players. It's, there's a system that's adaptable. There's players on the bench that can come on. There's a variety of ways this team can hurt you. It's not as simple now as just shut down that one player or these 2 players.
Yeah, and on that note, I think this is a good time to talk about, I guess, linking what you're just talking about, how they've become, I guess, a more balanced threat going forward, and like the players that have enabled them to do that. So again, we've got another viz here, and this is how PSG's final third entries have evolved. And, it's in the 2023-24 season, it might not look like too unbalanced, let's say, but what you often got, especially in the Champions League, I'd say, in the second half of it, when Bradley Barcola broke through last season, people might remember he was really starting to light it up in the early knockout stages, and there's clips going around of him in the Ligue. The way to try and fit him in with Kylian Mbappe was basically play both of them off the left. And quite often it was like PSG trying to overload the left, and teams, I remember Dortmund just coming up with a plan to stop them there. Then they switched it to Dembele on the right. I think that's where you got a lot of the entries there as well, like coming back round to enter the final third that way. With Mbappe gone, we can see like it's become a lot more focused on those wide areas. But I also think as well that's like, because the players, as we've mentioned about Dembele, he's playing down the middle, but he's also drifting out wide, and they've just become a very threatening side very threatening team on both sides of the pitch. I mean, I'll let you have the pleasure of talking about some of their attackers. We've got Kvaratskhelia, who recently arrived, Barcola as well. I mean, Dembele is the one stealing the headlines, but there's a lot more to PSG's attack, right, than just him.
I think so. Kvaratskhelia is a really interesting one, because I think it's not just as much about his quality and the ball carrying threat that he offers, but the fact by having that extra winger there, that player that can play both sides, gives you more flexibility in how you use Barcola, because you can swap them over all of a sudden. It means you've got that extra player also in Ligue 1, where you can then use Doué, or you can use Lee in a deeper position. You don't need one of them to come on and fill in for 20 minutes or half an hour playing on the wing. So that's not me trying to suggest that Kvaratskhelia is a depth signing, because he isn't, but I think it's having that quality in those profiles to balance you out sort of further around the pitch, because there are points earlier on this season, even still, especially in the Champions League early rounds, where we were saying is there, like, do you need to find a way to get, once he's fit, a Gonzalo Ramos, a number 9 profile who can stand in the box and just score tap-ins, and then Ousmane Dembele is basically sort of taken over that role. But it's hugely because of the supply line coming into him, right? You see the quality that you've got of João Neves, especially to pick those passes, to break lines. His assist numbers have been really, really good, and that's someone who settled really quickly after moving across from Portugal. Vitinha sort of as a controller, even deeper down. I think his pass numbers against Liverpool were absolutely phenomenal. His completion rate is really, really good. They've got real tempo controllers there that can speed the game up or sort of slow them down. So I think there's, as you mentioned, a really good balance now, and that kind of bears out the visit that you were mentioning that we've got, that breaks down sort of across the vertical 5 zones, as we like to look at the 2 half spaces, the middle channel, and then the 2 wings. We're talking 80% now of their final third entries in the Champions League this season have been right out on the wings. They get those 3-man combinations really well, where sort of a fullback will join in, could be overlapping or underlapping. The centre back is happy to step out with the ball. You've got the winger that can, as you say, sort of stay higher, can roll inside, running behind. Then Dembele might pull across, and that's up from sort of 50% in 2019-20. So it's interesting that we're talking about them being more balanced, and they are, but the way that's actually manifesting makes them, at least in terms of when you take the data, actually more specific in terms of really exploiting those wide areas, because they know teams are going to congest the middle of the pitch, and it's probably partly a defensive tactic, that we see from Pep Guardiola as well, where you say, look, if you play too many passes through the middle, it's something that actually Roberto De Zerbi's Marseille are having problems with this season. If you can be too central sometimes, you lose it, and suddenly that space, if you have committed your fullbacks on, it's there for teams to hit you the other way. So I think part of the reason why they look so good at controlling games and pinning teams in is because when they do lose it, because they're out wide most of the time, they can box teams in, commit a foul, won't get the yellow card, can force an opposition throw-in or something, that they've got, I think, better fail-safes as well. So we're not just talking about being good in attack, but also not being bad in defence.
Yeah, and that's a really good point to mention as well when we're talking about PSG losing the ball, because something that I think there is still a bit of a fear about PSG is the midfield, right? And the midfield that played against Liverpool, I think the previews all indicated that Fabio Ruiz, Vitinha, João Neves, these are 3 midfielders who are very talented on the ball, but are they actually going to be able to battle with the physicality of Liverpool's midfield and midfields beyond Liverpool if they're to go deeper into the Champions League? But they do seem to have battled quite well. I mean, there's some stats I managed to get up here of the fact that midfield I've just mentioned, Vitinha, Neves and Ruiz, they collectively won 30 of 40 ground duels across 2 legs against Liverpool. And João Neves, despite him being tiny when you watch him, I think he only lost 3 of his ground duels, 14 out of 17, which is an incredible number. And you could really see him buzzing around on the pitch, right? Like when PSG did lose the ball, just flying into tackles and winning it. Do you have any thoughts on them as well? The fact that despite feeling like they shouldn't really be able to compete physically, they seem to be anyway.
Yeah, I think perhaps the English perspective on physicality has changed and gone backwards a little bit compared to what it might be sort of elsewhere in Europe. And I'm not claiming to speak for the whole of Europe here, but I know that in England we see now a lot of big number 6s especially, or sort of big defensive midfielders. You think of the Rodri, the Declan Rice types, even Ryan Gravenberch. Now you're talking about sort of trying to find that blend of stylish player that can be big and tall as well. PSG maybe have that a bit with Fabio Ruiz, but he often is sort of more of a number 8 actually pushing forward, and often it will be sort of João Neves or Vitinha actually playing that sort of deeper role. You're right in that was sort of those games were big litmus tests for I think them. I was looking at some numbers at the start of the season, or slightly later in the league phase. In terms of like collective experience and how much that matters, because PSG was such a young team, and saying are they too young almost to succeed in the Champions League? And I was running through the numbers of saying how is there that myth about experience is always needed to win, you can't win without it. Of course, it's not always a perfect indicator as age and experience. You can be young and experienced. Donnarumma is probably a great example of that. Might not be too old, but has loads of sort of caps at a top level.
And you're always surprised of how old he is. I think he's only 25 years old.
Yeah, he's a great
Feels
example
like
of
he's been
that.
around for ages.
It does, and because he has, players, Mbappe, similar players that come through and break through at a really young age. But that squad overall had an awful lot of the PSG squad this season, had an awful lot of European experience, and there's a number I found from a research paper, I think it was, that was saying sort of 650 European appearances combined is sort of the golden threshold of teams over that, barring I think it was Barcelona once a few seasons ago, always made it into the knockout rounds. They either had sort of the street smarts or the quality, the know-how. But the problem with PSG was I think a lot of that was sort of backloaded. It was Marquinhos, it was Donnarumma that had all that experience. maybe perhaps Presnel Kimpembe as well, was obviously just coming back from injury. So actually they maybe lacked that sort of up top and in terms of the variety of goal scorers there. So what I think they've managed to do now is replace that Marco Verratti mold that they had. That, you know, people talk about sort of losing Mbappe as a big miss. I think Verratti, again, another great example of one of those players who was so physical and great, and his way of doing that was probably more slide tackles and you know, sort of ground combat, and they've managed to make that work because of how Luis Enrique's style is to play, which is, well, we're not going to launch goal kicks all that often. We will be direct and going behind, but most of the time we're going to play short. We're going to keep it on the floor, and that means when we do lose it and we have games sort of controlling the tempo in the way that we want it, then, well, the ball's on the floor and John Everson go and be scrappy and be quick and be agile. So I think they've been a lot better this season, barring perhaps the Bayern and the Arsenal games. I think earlier on in the season in the Champions League, they've definitely, and this is a big sign of a top team, played games in the way they want to play them. Not only have they won them and been good, but they've actually, I think, turned a lot of the games into matches of how they want them to be. Even Le Classique, for example, in the home and away games against Marseille, where, you know, they've turned occasions into matches, which is really, really important.
I think that's a really good point to bring up, especially against the backdrop of previous PSG sides, because I think a lot has been said this season. We've spoken about it as well, about they've ditched the superstar project. They finally did the thing that everyone wanted them to do, really. And, you know, now they're the team that can win the Champions League, and they were never near it before, which isn't totally fair. Like, this is a team who reached the Champions League final in 2020. They reached the semi-final a year later as well under Mauricio Pochettino, which often does get forgotten about. So it's perhaps not fair to say like the superstar project was a complete failure, as it wasn't. But I think a difference to make between the teams I think of, even Thomas Tuchel's team with Icardi, Neymar, Mbappe and Di Maria, is that point you were mentioning, playing games the way they want to play them, rather than kind of letting the opposition dictate those games. I think when I think of the previous PSG teams, it was a case of let's kind of sit in a bit and try and hit these teams on the counter, or give it to our individual players and see what they can do and let them dictate the game. But now I think the biggest difference here is we're seeing PSG like take more control of games collectively, which is, I think, a very interesting point. And I think that's what's kind of made them more likable. I mean, did you have any quick thoughts as well on the superstar thing? Because I like to think you're in the same camp as me, as it wasn't a complete failure, and that does often get forgotten about.
You like to think? No, I am. I am. Yeah, there's obviously a lot more longevity, I think, to the way they're looking at doing it now, where, again, you're less reliant on that individual brilliance. There were some stats that I was looking at in terms of just early on under Luis Enrique in the Champions League, how much they struggled to score in the first half. They really didn't score many first half goals at all, and more recently, games against Brest, the home and away games, against Stuttgart, they scored 3 in the first half, and obviously scored very early on against Liverpool at Anfield. So they've definitely become better at fast starting games. I think that's why, because they're not as reliant on those individual players to sort of, you know, get warm without the first half, get into the game. And last season it was very much a case of like Mbappe game breaking and needing his quality to get them back into matches. I will make the point as well that Mbappe wasn't a superstar when he joined. They obviously, you know, paid quite a lot of money for him. Obviously, it's a bit different with him being sort of, you know, Paris-born and coming through the, you know, Clairefontaine and then at Monaco. But he's a great example of the approach that they're taking again now of like, buy the good young French talent from elsewhere, even if you haven't developed it. They've got a quite good academy that's developing really well, and they're seeming to sort of take the Manchester City approach of selling those players for good fees and getting some into the first team. We've mentioned Desiree Doué, a graduate of the Rennes Academy, Brady Barcola from Lyon. So they're, you know, taking the other talent, and I think part of that helps to keep those other teams sort of weak because you're just taking their best players. Rennes is a complete aside of, you know, really capitulated sort of past season or so from being a European side. Lyon, of course, were fighting relegation at one point last season. So there's broader things at play in Ligue 1 which mean that the gap between PSG and the rest of the league seems to stay that big, or perhaps keep growing a bit bigger. And I think means people quite unfairly just sort of see it as always a case of, oh, well, it's just Ligue 1, like PSG, you know, might as well hand the title to them on the opening day. It's like, they are really, really convincing, and actually it sort of took a bit of time, I think, for them to prove that in Europe this season. And even after the first leg, I did a piece sort of saying, you know, that PSG are really back. That is part of the problem is that before they didn't get results in Europe, and they didn't have performances either. They were unconvincing and they lost. Sure, they've lost this first leg here, but they were phenomenal. You look at their success in the duels, you look at, you know, how few chances Liverpool had. I think 2 or 3 shots and scored with one of them late on that, all the chances PSG had, and then lo and behold, they, went to Anfield in previous seasons where we've seen them in the second leg, sort of the round of 16, be utterly abject, that they sort of already turned it on.
Speaking of the Champions League, they're not through yet. They've still got Aston Villa to play, and Unai Emery's side could very much go and knock them out. I mean, I'm sure he'd like to, being a former manager of the club. What do you think are Villa's biggest challenges for PSG? I've got one specific one. I don't know if you had any other ones.
Sure. I think as we sort of mentioned, the midfield battle, I think that'll be really, really interesting. That there's a lot of physicality on both sides. I think Morgan Rogers especially will be hard for PSG to defend against. John McGinn, sort of players that can receive back to goal, which is a different type of challenge, I think, to what they face a lot of the time. We mentioned how good they can be as a midfield three, sort of pressing and counter-pressing, but actually those are good players that can sort of be picklocks or solutions to such an aggressive sort of man-for-man press. And if Villa are to go over it, and if they've got sort of the, if Emi Martinez is playing and has the distribution, then Ollie Watkins as a channel runner especially is phenomenal. I think Marquinhos and Pacho have sort of dealt really well with sort of players running in behind, Liverpool game especially, but there's not many players that have the quality that he does, sort of running both sides, finishing off both feet, that you can say he's someone that, you need to make sure that, he's stopped.
Yeah, I have another fear about Aston Villa as well, which is the fact that, weirdly, as someone who likes French football quite passionately and likes to defend Ligue 1, I think, as people have kind of clocked onto, I do think Ligue 1 might not be the best prep for Aston Villa, but not maybe for the reasons people expect. It's worth mentioning that this is an argument that gets chucked out against PSG every year, and I think it's the idea that the competition they face is, not up to the standard, and they come into the Champions League and they're shocked. That's the argument you hear every single year. What we've kind of spoken about as well is that Ligue 1 has been a bit different this year. There's a lot of teams that will actually try and press PSG, and they won't just sit in. Lens under Will Still, everyone's favourite football manager guy, which I know he loves to hear. He has got Lens playing in a very man-to-man system, very aggressive, almost reminds you of Gasperini's Atalanta. You've mentioned De Zerbi at Marseille. He's tried a similar approach sometimes against PSG. Most recently, I think most tellingly, they played Saint-Etienne, who are 17th in Ligue, and they won 6-1, and in that game you might have expected them to be playing, a Saint-Etienne team who just sat in a block, didn't do anything, and, ended up getting turned over, right? But what Saint-Etienne tried to do under foreign coach they've got, Eric Hoyland, he tried to go basically toe-to-toe with PSG, and very nearly succeeded in the first half, where first half ended 1-1 thanks to a PSG penalty, but the possession was about 50-50. And it's just a trend of PSG facing teams who will try and challenge them, who will try and press them and maybe give them a bit of space to exploit. And Aston Villa aren't going to do that, I don't think. They will, obviously Aston Villa can press high and can cause problems, but they are also quite happy, as we've seen many times in the Premier League, to be a bit passive and sit off and stay in a block. And I do worry for PSG. They are a very exciting team to watch, but they almost remind you, I don't know about you, they remind me of the moment of Luciano Spalletti's Napoli, a team from Europe. Everyone was kind of getting behind as this very attractive attacking side to watch. You felt like they could break down any defence around Europe. And then they did start towards the end of that season, and in the Champions League, I do forget the team they played, Milan, wasn't it? They did, in the end, struggle to break down a team that was sitting deep. And it did show, as fun as they can be, a very good defence, an Unai Emery defence, might be enough to stutter PSG. So I guess we'll have to see with that. But anyway, let's put that to one side. This is a PSG podcast, not an Aston Villa one. And let's imagine they do get past Aston Villa. From there, it's Real Madrid or Arsenal in the semis. And on the other side of the draw, they've got Barcelona, Dortmund, Bayern and Inter. It's a very strong set of teams. I think it's a very exciting set of teams for the Champions League. Simple question. Do you think PSG have what it takes to go all the way?
Yeah, I think they do. I mean, they reached the Final Four last season, didn't they? And we think they're a lot more convincing this year. And they've sort of felt like they've peaked at the right time in terms of how much they've built throughout the competition and have got that real settled squad. We can never know if injuries or things might crop up that could derail them, but I think they're in a really healthy place. They've got all the makings now of a team that can dominate a league, but also I think Manchester City were a great example of a team that struggled to do it for a long time, of playing knockout football is at times not quite a different sport, but it's a different way of playing games and definitely managing them. I had a quick look as well at the Opta analyst sort of projection numbers for the teams that are most likely to go through. PSG are sort of second favourites to win it now behind Barcelona. They've been given a 72% chance of reaching the semi-finals by Opta and a 36% chance of reaching the finals. So look, these numbers are perhaps never quite perfect, but it's, I think, really positive from their perspective to see them that they're ranked above Arsenal, Inter, Real Madrid, some real sort of European heavyweights. I think they're one of the most pleasing things is how good they've been, I think, while sort of being stylish as well. They've really managed to do both sides of that.
Yeah, I think when I look at this final four, I think I'll have a stronger idea of what PSG will do. And let's assume they get past Aston Villa, but I think the performance is going to matter. If they really struggle to get past Villa, I think Arsenal are kind of, an exaggerated version of Villa. That's at least how I imagine Arteta would set up against PSG. A very strong low block and basically looking to shut PSG out. And I think Arsenal could do that better than Aston Villa. That said, if PSG do tear Villa apart, then maybe you do look at that and align more with the statistics of Opta and think, actually, they could go all the way here. I don't think I've got a clear answer from you there, though. How far do you think PSG can go? It's a final question.
I have them to make the final this season, I think.
Cool. Okay. I had them to make the final against Bayern and lose, but Bayern have lost all their players to injury, so I'm less sure now. But I'll back you and say they get to the final too. But anyway, thank you, Liam, for today. You've been brilliant talking about PSG, something we do every day, every week, every hour. It's been wonderful. Michael Bailey will return to our regular Thursday podcast. See you soon.